Hi, I'm Jay Phelan. Let's learn some biology. When you study biology, it can be easy to fall into the trap of thinking, oh yeah, it's about plants and animals or about microbes or things like that, but that somehow humans are separate from all that, that we are removed from everything, and we're not separate from the world we live in. Like every species, we're part of the ecosystems that we live in. And because of that, our activities have an impact on those ecosystems. We alter habitats, we influence the distribution and abundance of other species. And for humans, this really matters because we're a spectacularly successful species. By almost any measure, the number of individuals or the variety of habitats in which we can live, we do really well. But there's a downside to that, which is that everywhere we go, we influence the habitat, and sometimes we do it in ways that can have really negative impacts on other species, on the environment. So what I want to talk about are just some of the ways that humans can have disruptive impacts on the environment. And because I don't want it to just feel like, oh, everything humans do is bad, oh, we're destroying the planet or whatever. When I first started studying biology, that's all they would do when we got to ecology. They would be yelling at me, and I was like, what did I do? And so I don't want it to feel like that because there are some success stories, and even at the very core of this is understanding that humans have a place in our ecosystems. So let's talk about a few of these. I'll talk about three where humans have had a disruptive impact on the environment, and then I'll talk about one success story that I think gives us a lot of hope for the future. So the first disruptive impact that humans have is related to invasive species. So what this means is introducing non-native species into an area. And this is really problematic. You wouldn't think it, but they tend to compete very well with the native species because they don't have any predators or diseases there because they've been moved to a place where they didn't exist before. So no one is adapted to eating them and so on. What happens in a lot of cases, you might have, for instance, this bird called the monk parakeet. Some people brought them as pets into the US, and as invariably happens, they escaped and then they bred in the wild. Now they're in 11 different states and they go crazy because they don't suffer a lot of predation, they don't suffer a lot of diseases, and they end up now being kind of a nuisance in a lot of places because of their large population sizes and the degree to which they are successful. Another species is something called cane toads, and these are native to Central and South America. They were introduced to a number of places, including the US, but also to Australia in order to control some sugarcane pests. They said, oh, let's get these cane toads because they will eat the pests, then they'll all die off, and then we'll have solved the problem. That turned out to be a huge mistake because they consumed the pests that they were brought in to consume, but they started eating other things. They started reproducing at very high rates. They just have become a huge pest where it's almost impossible to get rid of them, and they are giant and they are a menace to pets and to livestock and to all sorts of aspects of the habitat. They get really, really big. Another case of an invasive species that's led to just hugely disruptive impacts is something called the zebra mussel. There are giant boats that will go around the world delivering stuff, and what they will do in some places is take on ballast water so it can lower the boat, and then later they will get rid of it, and that caused these zebra mussels to be transported into the Great Lakes in the US. Because they're not a native species, they don't have predators, diseases there, and their population growth took off, became a huge problem. They are so plentiful. Look at this. This is just from a boat that was in the Great Lakes. They just started growing on the propeller when the boat was left sitting. There was a shopping cart that had been abandoned in some water. They grow right over that. Here's another one, a plant called kudzu. It was imported from Japan because people thought, hey, we have these areas where there's a lot of erosion. Here's a plant that can grow quickly. The roots will help keep these hills in place. They'll keep the soil from washing away. Seemed like a good idea. Now, turns out that it's so successful, for all the same reasons that invasive species sometimes are successful, that it covers more than 7 million acres in the southeastern US, costs more than $100 million in lost productivity. You can see here, it eats buses, it eats kids, houses. No, I'm kidding. But it's pretty bad. Once it starts growing places, it's very hard to get rid of. So invasive species is a big problem that a lot of people don't think about. What are the solutions? Well, the solutions have to rely on better regulation and restriction of introducing species into places where they don't belong. And you'll see this at airports, where they want to make sure that you're not inadvertently bringing something in, or if you're driving across a border, same thing. They want to make sure that this doesn't happen, because in almost every case, it's not intentional. Another disruptive impact that's linked to humans is the increased greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly you are aware of this because it is such a pressing problem and it's in the news all the time. What we see is this, that energy from the sun passes through the atmosphere, warms the Earth's surface. We talked about this when we were learning about weather. Some of the energy is reflected back up and it escapes the atmosphere. But some of the energy is absorbed by greenhouse gases that are in the environment. It remains in the atmosphere and it causes the temperature to go up. So that's why they call it a greenhouse, because the sunlight can get in, but not all the heat can get out, so it gets hotter and hotter. What are the greenhouse gases? Well, these are typically things that have carbon in them. So things like carbon dioxide, things that are emissions from car engines, internal combustion engines. These are emissions from power plants, various types of machines, things related to industrialization. Here's a graph that shows how the increase of atmospheric CO2 has gone up just over the past decades, very, very fast, the rate at which it's going up. Importantly, as the rate of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the environment has gone up, we have seen, as expected, a big increase in the average temperature. If you look, for instance, at glaciers in Alaska, just between early 1900s and early 2000s, you can see giant glaciers that are completely melted. If we look from satellite data, we can see that ice caps are melting at a pretty high rate too. We're losing them because of these increases in temperature. What's the solution to this? Well, we have to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. The burning of fossil fuels is probably the most dramatic way that humans are going to be able to do that. We're making some progress towards this, but people are worried that we're not making it quickly enough to stop these changes that have already started happening. A third disruptive impact from humans is deforestation. By this I mean cutting down tropical forests so that you can use the land for agriculture. And what happens here is that when you cut down some area of forest that has a really high biodiversity, especially because they're near the equator, you end up losing tons of species, and then you replace it with a very small number of agriculturally valuable species. And we end up losing that biodiversity that has lots of different value. If you look at a world map, you can see that before human influence, we had tropical rainforests extending in huge areas in Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, and now you look today, it is significantly reduced from what it was. This is a tricky one to try and solve. Obviously, we can plant more trees, but it's very hard when you have areas where people are trying to have agriculture, to get food, to feed themselves, when there are incentives to producing things that you can sell. It certainly requires international cooperation, which can be very hard because not every government has a similar agenda. This is a tricky issue that the world is wrestling with right now. I hope I'm not bumming you out too much. Let me tell you a disruptive impact of humans that I think has a happy ending, and that is the ozone layer depletion. This is different from greenhouse gas emissions. This is just, there is this protective part of the atmosphere that comes from this chemical ozone. And what it does is it blocks a lot of the ultraviolet radiation that comes from the sun, so it keeps us much safer from damage to our DNA from ultraviolet radiation, which is a source of energy. We first learned that the ozone layer was being broken down 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and it turned out that products that humans had created, specifically CFCs, stands for chlorofluorocarbons, but these were things that people used as propellants. If you wanted to have shaving cream come out of a can or whipped cream come out of a can, you would add these CFCs. Or if you were making a refrigerator, they used them in the cooling system. Seemed reasonable, but it turned out that they were being also released into the atmosphere, and over time they would react with the ozone there and they would break it down. How do you deal with this? Well, for starters, they said, hey, we got to stop making products with CFCs so that we are not adding more of them to the environment and breaking down the ozone layer, because that could have catastrophic results for humans if all of a sudden we don't have this protection from ultraviolet radiation. So we stopped things like making styrofoam. We started coming up with other ways that you could get hairspray or shaving cream to come out of a can or whipped cream or any of those things that didn't involve CFCs. And there was a lot of international cooperation here when the science became clear. Hey, these things we made are doing this bad thing and it's going to have bad consequences for everyone. By banning the production and use of these CFCs, what we've seen is little by little the ozone layer is repairing itself. When you look at satellite data, what you can see is that where there used to be this big hole in it, little by little the growth of the hole has stopped, and now it even appears to be getting smaller. So it seems like it's possible if you reduce production of something, you reduce emissions, if you have international cooperation and a trust in the science, you can end up solving a problem. That makes me think that for these other issues, you can't just think, oh, this is too big for me. There's nothing I can do. Turns out that people banding together can actually have a significant impact at stopping and even reversing these disruptive impacts. So humans can have disruptive impacts on the environment. And if we want to have an effective protection of natural resources, we have to do the science to figure out what are the impacts we're having. And then we have to have good policy making. Then you have to have international cooperation. All those things turn out to be really important, but together there can be noticeable and significant impacts. That's pretty heavy. So I hope the take-home message still was humans are really successful. And humans can change our behavior, and humans can measure and understand what our impacts are, and we can change them if we want to. So it doesn't have to be too negative an idea. I'm going to stop here. Bye.